7 o'clock, 14 seconds. Okay, we good to go? All right. All right. Well, I will call to order the Lakewood City Council study session for March 20th, 2017, 7 p.m. I believe the first day of spring. Will the clerk please call roll?
Hall.
Here.
Hoop.
Here.
Wickman. One. Here. Franks.
Here.
Harrison. Royball.
Here.
Vincent.
Here.
Abel.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Shakti.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great, thank you. So just a couple housekeeping items before we start. Karen Harrison will not be joining us tonight. She's sick, so she's watching us from home, and hopefully she feels better. And on a sad note, I'd like to just let folks know that we lost one of our planning commissioners, passed away a couple weeks ago, Julia Kirkpatrick. So she had served the city for quite some time and been a advocate in the neighborhood and represented Ward 2. So we send our condolences to her family, and we'll have more information about services as we get those. Okay, thank you. So we have a housing study update, and prior to that would be public comment, but I imagine it's pretty light and nobody's seen what we're about to see. So there probably isn't any public comment. So we'll move right in to the housing study update, and I'll start with Nanette. Barb, did that go on for you? Okay.
Good evening, City Council and Mayor. Today is your second education session, and it will start leading to, you'll see some results from the survey that we've been conducting with our top employers of the city. And I don't think there's much more I can add. I wanted to give one housekeeping. We're trying to get a web page up on the housing study, and anticipate in doing that about 2 to 3 weeks down the road. It will have these PowerPoint presentations, and as reports come out, the draft reports, we'll be putting them online for citizens to view it, and we'll also connect them to these hearings so they can be part of the education. We just haven't got the web page set up yet. With that, I'll reintroduce you again to David Schwartz from EPS, who will do the whole presentation. All I can do is encourage you to ask questions when you take notes, and then ask questions at the end, because it will frame the third presentation to you. We're contemplating right now looking at doing the developer cost analysis, or giving you education what goes into a developer's thought process, and how much does it cost for them to develop land in Lakewood at our next education seminar, unless we get some different feedback from you tonight. So with that, David, thanks. And he just came back from Australia. So, yeah.
Hopefully you were working hard, I bet.
I actually used only 18 hours of vacation while I was gone. My family is there. My wife is Australian, and we go to visit family regularly, and so.
Very cool. Welcome back. We're glad to have you. And
well, thank you.
the community's excited to keep on seeing this and learning more as we go.
Well, I can tell you as a brief aside, on the note of Australia, the housing market in Australia is a little bit exaggerated from what's going on here. There are quite a few more problems that are top of mind in people's eyes there, and so I think as much as there is discussion about housing affordability issues and other types of issues, there are a lot of things that are very different about what's going on down under that should make us feel pretty lucky to be where we are, I think. On that note, this session, whether or not you want to call it a study session, informational session, educational session, depending on whether you want to take a passive or an active role, is up to you. But I have a good number of slides here. So consistent with last time, we're going to end at about midnight, if that sounds okay. Good. And questions until 12:30. I hope that's okay with
Awesome.
all the brave souls out in the audience.
Our police agents are excited.
All right. No, I'm kidding. There are a lot of slides, and there are a number of topics that I want to get through. First of which is just a recapitulation of the first study session. Then go into a number of elements of supply characteristics. So we generally talked about some supply concepts last time and generally talked about some demand concepts last time, and a little bit of the intersection. But we're going to go into a little more depth with those today. Some and perhaps more than 50% of the slides at the beginning of this presentation are responses to questions that you all
Be
posed.
closer to the mic, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. There are responses to questions that you posed last time. So I'm happy to present you with a substantial amount of analysis for that. The demand characteristics is a preliminary analysis of the employer survey that has been submitted. Last time I think we had something like 1,000 or so responses. We have about 1,300 or more responses at the moment. We're hoping for more participation from a selected number of major employers. So that will happen in the next few weeks. And then there's a section on the intersection of supply-demand characteristics, so the components and how those influence price and quantity, and then an overview of governance perceptions, which are related to the survey. And so there were some questions in the survey that pertain to governance and the perception of governance, so that we did this intentionally so that we could make some linkages with the citizen survey as well as some general sorts of political and public perception surveys. So the first thing is just to go through a couple of the previous study session takeaways. This is verbatim from the last slide of the last presentation, where 4 major points were really the focus of the content last time. Housing variety, we had all those images of different housing types. The variety is not just for aesthetics. There's really a community development and economic development concern to that. Because after all, housing availability, along with transportation access, which is the third point down there, equates to workforce mobility. That also translates into greater productivity. Housing supply for all income levels is also equivalent to workforce mobility. That is, labor force access from the business standpoint, and also workforce mobility for the household standpoint, because that translates directly into cost burden. And we went through a number of cost burden things. I've got an additional cost burden slide at the end of this one as well to show you something new. But meeting demand in terms of supply means more than just building houses. It means building a community. And that's really what all of you are doing. You're really representing your constituents for the sake of building a community and ensuring that it is built right for tomorrow's residents. So what we're seeing in general surveys is that tomorrow's residents are placing greater importance on complete neighborhoods, so access to amenities, closer proximity to amenities, and those amenities include transportation access, which affects quality of life and the productivity. There were a couple of questions last time about what type of effect proximity to amenities has on housing values. There were also some other questions related to proximity of different types of amenities to housing. Those are included in this slide presentation. And then we'll go through the household preferences. I stated that household preferences are evolving and gave you a glimpse of some of those notions that many people are still preferring the single-family detached home. But households are increasingly preferring to have those in proximity to amenities. There are a lot of results in this survey that indicate that there is an increased interest in small lot single family. As you might understand, small lot single family has a smaller footprint of use of land, and so that has greater potential for having access to amenities. So we'll see a lot of this as we go through the whole slide, and there is, and still of what you see in the in this presentation is still just the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the other findings. I just extracted about 10% of what I thought was really compelling from the preliminary results. And then just to briefly reacquaint you with the income spectrum for households of either tenure. I'm not really going to refer to this again in this slide presentation, but just to orient yourself, the median income for 2015 or 2016 is actually this is the 2015 number that says 2016. It was $60,984, so that's the 100% of area median income. Multiply that by 80, 50, and 30, and you get those other numbers. Multiply it by 120, 150, and 200, and you get the other numbers. As I pointed out last time, the purpose of this is to orient ourselves around different segments of household demand and housing demand. And there are analyses that we can do looking at the affordability of housing product. There is analysis that we can do in terms of wages earned and household incomes, and therefore the demand. These other labels here indicate what the affordable purchase price is. In the upper band is the affordable purchase price for somebody earning that maximum category income, and then the maximum rent possible. So somebody earning median income could afford, with today's underwriting standards and today's interest rates before the federal funds rate takes effect and the mortgage rates go up marginally in the next quarter or so. The affordable purchase price is $245,000 for somebody earning the median income in Lakewood, and the affordable rent is $1,120 a month. That includes an exemption for utilities. So there's a $70 a month average utility expense that's backed out of that. So it's so all of these are based on that formula of the normative formula that a household should be spending no more than 30% of its income on housing, and that's obviously divided by 12 for the rental minus the utilities allowance, and then through all the other factors for the purchase price. So with that, let's get into some supply characteristics. So there are a number of slides on housing values and the influence of proximity to amenities on those housing values. Up in the right-hand corner, I have a parenthetical note, which is for me and for you, so you can follow how many more slides of this section there are. That's not to be a daunting prospect. It's simply to keep us going, really. So this first analysis is a year-built analysis. This is a price per square foot analysis, a trend line from the year 2000 to 2016. And you can see that prices have escalated from about $129 a square foot in 2000 to about $159 in, actually it's a little more, $162, I think, in 2016. That's approximately a 2% annual average rate of growth. You don't need, you can quote, actually don't quote me on that because I don't have the number exactly in front of me. But you can see the increase and the decrease in prices. Lakewood's prices really peaked a little bit before the rest of the metro area's prices peaked. The metro area peaked in 2006 and started to plummet down to 2010. Lakewood is a little bit more stable, I would say, than the metro area. Its housing prices, and so it peaked in 2005 and took another 6 years to come down. I think 2014 is a bit of an anomaly. I think there's a bit more analysis that can be done there. But the next thing that I want to show you is are the prices per square foot for housing inventory built by different period, and I think this is interesting in some senses. So housing built before 1980 has tracked with the overall trend. That's because, as we saw in the first presentation, about 70% of all the housing supply in the city of Lakewood was built before 1980. So obviously, it's weighted. The overall is weighted by the units built before 1980. These are the units built between 1980 and 89. They were not kind of in line with the pricing of the overall market between 2014, but have since exceeded the price per square foot average. There could be a number of things going on here. Housing inventory gets renovated periodically, and the sales of units that represent this age category could have reflected a number of those. There's no way to tell in our data whether that's the case. Parcel data that comes in subsequent years might reveal some of that. Here is the inventory of units built between 90 and 99. It was priced above the general market during the first decade in this and has since corrected down to the average. Housing built between 2000 and 2009. You can see clearly there an effect of the valuation of units recently built up to the housing bust. And then there is housing built between 2010 and 16, which hasn't fared as well because it came online being pro-formed probably too optimistically, is my guess. Working with developers, the old saying is that no pro forma ever gets better over time, and I think this is proof that that's the case. So there are a number of things that I want to get into, and these are some responses to questions that I heard last time, and I've expanded on a couple of them because I heard specifically one about parks and one about proximity of housing to new apartment projects. So I've included, the objective of this was to identify how existing amenities influence housing value around the city. And so the idea was to identify basic indications of either positive or negative influence. We're looking at, so we're concentrating the analysis around a quarter-mile radius of all the schools, all the parks, open space, and green belts, all the full-service restaurants, all the light rail stations, all high-frequency bus stops, all grocery stores, and all new apartment projects. So the first one is generally just to revisit the where the construction has been, because the question that I posed last time was, is housing being built in proximity to amenities? As we'll see later, there is a great deal of interest in housing being near amenities, and also a commensurate willingness to pay for it. But here was these were the building permits by type. Those are the employment centers, and those were all of the amenities. So first one is proximity to schools. All the gray blobs, there are tiny dots. They represent about 56,000 sales over the last 16 years or 17 years. These are the schools with the little red flags. And here are the sales. So all of the sales that are located in a quarter mile of schools have been flagged for analysis, so to speak. So here was the overall trend, and here is the collection of housing that is located in a quarter mile proximity to schools. There is a bit of noise, if you will, in statistical nomenclature in this data because there are a lot of schools, and some are high-performing schools, some are not high-performing schools. Because these trends don't really indicate much of anything. So I broke it down by school and identified that different from the average, the overall 17-year average of $146 a square foot, there are a number of schools, and you can see on the columns on the right hand indicate that there is a positive housing value premium associated with those schools, and the ones below that are negative premiums. I listed out a selection of the top 60% of these, from Miller Special Education down to Eber Elementary School. Those have 10 to 19% housing value premium on them. I can get you a better copy of this because I don't suppose you can read this at all. I can't. The next one is the proximity to parks, open space, and trails. Again, all housing. They're the parks. Now, here's something that there are parks in the north part of the city. I know you know that, but they are considerably smaller than the ones down south of the city. So there are housing sales that show up as being within a quarter mile of some kind of a park. Now, granted, if the city's GIS department has correctly coded everything as a park or open space, we have captured it. If there are little walkways that happen to be captured as a park, then I'm errantly capturing some of those sales. But nevertheless, we're looking at everything within a quarter mile of parks. There's the overall, and again, this is the same thing with schools, is that there really is not much of a distinction when you look at this on an overall average basis. So again, I broke it down. There are, in this list, there are about 80-some parks or something like that. It's about 62% of these fall on the positive spectrum. In the case of the parks, from Patterson Cottages to Glen Creighton Park, there is a 10 to 28% premium in housing value on the for the parks. I have no idea exactly what Patterson Cottages is. Does anybody?
It's a little head start up in
Yeah.
That makes sense. 'Cause it's in that
It's a Head Start center.
Does it have a park
It has some, it's on park property.
that are classified as a park? Okay. I didn't think that I had. All the other ones are parks. Anyway, I didn't think that I had left one little school on this list. But here again, there is a qualitative analysis that would need to be done, looking at why some of these, why 37%, 38% of these parks have a negative value to them. But it's likely that, in this analysis, I'm doing probably the most simple analysis that can be done that is accessible, so as not to confuse or to make it overly complicated with a hedonic model or a regression analysis, which are really two and the same, because there are influences that other geographic amenities place on housing values in the location of those other 38% of parks that are obviously bringing it down. It may be they may be underinvested areas in a number of ways, but that could be looked at a later point. The next one is full service restaurants. Again, the Hall of the Sales. These are the full service restaurants, uniquely located around major arterials. Clearly not many full-service neighborhood restaurants. Maybe that should be in the works sometime. So here are the sales in a quarter mile of full-service restaurants. This one's a little more interesting. They seem to have spiked up after the market correction, but they went down considerably to 2011. I didn't break this one down for the sake of just a lot of things put in front of you tonight. The next one is the light rail stations. Obviously, they're concentrated up in the north, and the sales, there are fewer of them. In fact, the one around the community college has 0 because there isn't any housing. And so in this one, we've got a very interesting trend here that indicates to me that in 2007 there was some speculation going on, followed by a market correction in 2008. The next one is the proximity to high-frequency bus stops. There are a lot more of those, but they obviously are located along an interesting pattern. This GIS shapefile I have has not been updated for the last year and a half. So if this looks like it's missing something, it could be. We could try to update this if it's important. But here we've also got the same data, and this one, was somewhat interesting, mildly, I suppose, but it doesn't show that big of a negative effect, given especially that the trend we're looking at in all of this data is through a couple different ends of a market cycle. The end of a previous apartment cycle, the start of another apartment cycle in 2010, and a full up and downward cycle in ownership housing. So we're looking at a very interesting and dynamic period of time here. Proximity to grocery stores may be the more interesting of all of them. This one shows a very interesting and I would say a generally positive trend. I know that when we were looking for a house and when we moved, we definitely wanted a grocery store within a quarter mile of our house, and so I suppose we paid a premium for it. And then here's the kind of juicy one, if you will, because this one is fraught with a number of, I shouldn't say fraught, I should say this one is built with a number of theories. That is, everybody has heard these theories. What kind of an effect do multifamily or apartment projects have on surrounding property values, surrounding ownership housing values? The theory is that, if it brings transients to a neighborhood or if it brings rental units to a neighborhood, it decreases the stability in that old adage of, home ownership increases political, social, community stability, and therefore it's going to have a negative effect on housing values. Well, we wanted to test that, to the extent that we could. So we're looking at all the new multifamily projects. The data that we used were all of those building permits. And we coded them by year as well, so that we could capture the sales in a quarter mile of those buildings, and also then evaluate. I think in the next slide I show you the methodology. Yeah. In this analysis, what we've done is we have identified the year of project completion, and then we're looking at housing values in the subsequent years. So if the theory holds that housing values decrease as a result of the completion of a new multifamily project or the addition of a new multifamily project, then in those subsequent years we should see some kind of a negative effect, some kind of a decrease in the rate of growth. So this is just an abbreviated little schematic of what we're looking at in terms of projects. There are approximately 100 projects, so this is just a generalization. So project 1 through 100, and in the time between 2001 and 2, 2 and 3, so on between 15 and 16, we're looking at the annual rate of growth between each of those years for all the housing sales in a quarter mile of every one of those projects. So the 30% here means that housing values around project 1 increased 30% over the previous year. In one of the other ones where it's 25 and -9, that means that in the period 2001 to 2, housing values increased 25%, and then decreased 9% in the following year. So we've got data that goes all the way out to 2015, 2016, so that we're looking at annual changes in every single year for every single project. So the idea is to take that, subtract the ward average, so the average price per square foot for each of the wards that these projects are in will equal then the difference. So that is, if 30% is the increase in housing values in a quarter mile around project 1, and the ward average was 9% increase for that year over year, then the difference is 21%. So we do this for all of those, and then we take them and put them into an ordered sequence. So here we want to look, because we want to do an analysis that says what happens in years subsequent to the addition of a multifamily project, we want to pull every one of the first years into the year 1 column, every one of the second years into the year 2 column, and so on. You can see those numbers go into appropriate cells. So the analysis is, do apartments affect surrounding property values? And so the chart here, which I may have made a little too gray, this first shows overall city average price changes. So rates of growth year over year. The first is 3.5%. So between 2001 and 2, average prices in the city. And I'm just showing the city for an example because I don't want to clutter it with 5 different or 6 different trend lines. So 3.5% growth in 1 to 2, 1.6% growth in 2 to 3, 2.7, you get the picture, it goes down the line. You see a bit of that volatility that I was talking about in 10 to 11, and then 13 to 14 is the negative 11.6. So that is overall city rates of growth. These are housing values in a quarter-mile proximity to apartments. So this is all the analysis in that methodology that I told you. I brought all the year ones forward, so they're all year ones. This is looking at things a little bit differently than we might, because we've got a couple things going on here. Like I mentioned, the ownership market cycle was ending in 2007. The rental market cycle began in 2010 then. There were about 50% or more of all the projects completed before 2004. So some of the effects are being washed away in this analysis, and some of them are not. So it isn't exactly an apples to apples comparison to link year 1 with 2001-2, although in more than 50% of the cases it may be appropriate. So nevertheless, there is this remarkable kind of sort of alignment of the up and down patterns over time. The difference being this. So in general, the first year of new apartment projects affecting surrounding property values is negative 0.5, negative 0.9, negative 0.6, 0.4, negative 1.6, and so on, up to today, which is 6%. So 6% above the rate of growth for the average ward level housing sale. So I don't know if there are a couple issues with this analysis. In general, what this says in average is that housing values in a quarter mile proximity to new apartment projects has a premium of about 1%, actually 0.8% to be precise. We're looking at a number of cycles in the market. This does not, however, imply a causality, though. That is a difficult analysis to perform. That is, we're not suggesting with this analysis that the new apartment project actually causes the price appreciation or depreciation. There are larger market supply and demand characteristics that are going on in this that would really need to be controlled for if you really wanted to go for that kind of an analysis. Because we've got 2 recessions in this period. So there are 3 ebbs and flows of market cycles in 2 different tenures in this. And so there are a number of issues that really are wrapped up in this kind of analysis. But we've taken a stab at looking at this from, I think, the more intuitive standpoint than a more complicated hedonic model would do, and then we'd just be bickering about the p-values of our coefficients. So I actually let me. I don't know. I wouldn't put it past some of you. So at this point, I've got 2 more slides in this supply series, but are there any questions you want to ask about this? Because I do have a summary slide about the proximity to amenities.
Yeah, Councilor Franks.
Not along the lines you were originally mentioning, but did have a couple questions. Wanted to know whether on those apartments, if there was any analysis into the quality of construction, if there was any breakdown to say that those trends followed if it was a higher quality property looking for the price points were higher versus lower. Was there any kind of parsing out of that information for those apartment complexes?
I would love to have been able to do that analysis, but the building permit information did not permit me to do that. In fact, we had a rather difficult time extracting even what I would consider the appropriate level of geographic detail in the building permit data. That's not to say that the building department wasn't easy to work with. They were very gracious with their time and very generous with their time. The data simply don't exist. In fact, the data didn't even exist for me to link the location of units with the number of units in a project. So as you're thinking about administrative advances in your system, maybe one side note might be to give more capabilities to the building department to track that in the future. So that is all to say that no, wasn't able to do that. We'd have to go through individual projects and do some research about that. But it would, I think that there would be something there.
Okay. And the second one is, did you or could you do any analysis for during the construction period? Because if you're thinking about somebody who may, be at the point where they need to sell and this project is going in, timing could be, did you look at that metric against, or that trend line, I should say, against if it was during the construction period, which sometimes can be a multi-year construction period?
Yeah, construction for those projects is typically about 18 months on average. And the problem is that window of time is almost too short. As it is, the analytical challenges that I've got on another slide here are already such that the sample sizes for each of the years for each of the 100 plus or minus projects is already getting pretty thin. There are some projects that have 40, 50 sales around them. You look for robust sample sizes of at least 30 when you're looking at this kind of granular data. But some of these have actually dropped below 30. And so to parse them out even further would really be asking for analytical problems. So it is a legitimate question, and it's a legitimate analysis. I chose to look at the subsequent years, as in the effect of it, and not the sort of the speculation of what's going to happen. Oh my gosh, I got to sell and get out of here because there's a big high rise or a low rise going in next to me.
Or just the noise and the factor that goes on while you're
Right.
doing that.
Right.
And I think the last question would be, did you look at the relationship between how closely spaced new developments were, just because we've got some that are going in fairly close together, and the overall impact of ones that are spaced very close together, and then therefore that density of those rental units then becoming at a saturation point, which tips the
Right.
trend line.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you I have done analyses like that in the past. My GIS guys are going to hate me if I ask them to calculate all the distances between every one of the housing sales and all the apartment projects. It is a program that GIS can run. It usually runs over a weekend to do calculations like that. But we can look into whether or not we can do that. It might be a bit of a wild goose chase. We'd have to come up with a theory that any project that is closer than 100 meters or something like that. So we'd have to parse everything down to, instead of looking at a quarter mile, we'd really want to look at the 100-meter radius or something like that, maybe an eighth of a mile radius. We'd be obviously slimming down the number of data points that we have per year per project, and with things already in the lower teens, it's probably going to reduce it down to single digits, and we're going to get outlier data points that are simply difficult to work with. But I always like an analytical challenge, so I'll make a note.
Well, I'm not assigning you work, just kind of throwing out some questions. We'll have to decide whether that's work or not. Also, if there's at any point, if there's just other experiences, others that have done this without us spending our own money, but to say another community similarly sized, similarly positioned, sometimes it's helpful. And I know that's difficult, and so I'm not asking for a response today, but maybe just keep that in mind, because I don't know that we're going to want to explore every tangent, just given the costs involved.
No, I can tell you that these kind of analyses are typically done by academics. They're the ones who have the time, and they have grad students and undergrads who love to do this kind of stuff so that they can learn how to do basic regression analysis and trending analysis. So thank you.
Ms. Vincent?
A question, your slides around apartments and for sales were from 2001 on. Do you have any data from those that were built prior to 2001?
No, I just
of the impact on the housing?
No, I just used the, I suppose we could use the parcel data, but the parcel data that I got does not have year built, so I wouldn't have been able to do that. I'd have to work with Jefferson County to get that information. But this was an analysis of building permit data, so it was just from 2016.
Okay, because there's, as you've already diagrammed the north side and the south side and things, and there's a lot of older stock,
properties.
older apartments in certain sections, and I don't know, it'd be interesting to see if that impact, because a brand-new apartment building in a certain area could have a positive impact around. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if you can get that or not.
Make a note of it.
Cool.
Thanks.
That's it.
Okay. All right, we'll move on. Just the conclusion of this. I didn't want to put this up first because I didn't want to get your wheels going too much and distracted. Now, I'm not setting you up for any kind of controversial findings here. These are actually far from controversial. So this is a ward level analysis on a price per square foot. This is overall. Guess who's first? Ward 1. Ward 2. Ward 3. Ward 4. And Ward 5. So overall, rather remarkable clustering when you look at the experience from 2000 to 2016. The difference between Ward 5 and Ward 2 actually is about a 0.8% annual average rate of growth. It's not a very big difference in rates of growth. Obviously, different experiences during the last decade, but very interesting. I generally say that you can characterize the city of Lakewood's housing market as pretty stable and not too volatile. The volatility has come in the rest of the metro area and in other metro areas around the country through great spurts of development. New development, speculative development, development that had no market precedent before it. So where you're bringing in an average, here you've got an average price per square foot of $175 for all old and new product in Ward 2 in 2016. It's not like somebody's bringing in something at $700 a square foot. That would be just, unprecedented, and that would be extremely risky. So there wasn't any development like that going on. There are outliers, and there is a market for higher segments, clearly, but that's not the kind of market that Lakewood has experienced. So in general, the takeaways from this proximity analysis, I mentioned the analytical challenges, sample sizes by individual year. There is still the issue of causality. It is difficult to disentangle the idea that, or the notion that you plant a new apartment project and you have a subsequent result. In reality, how I interpret the results of that analysis in terms of the proximity to new apartment projects is more that it is simply evidence that the market in those areas is strong enough to support new development. That is, land values are such to support that development, and developers are not exactly coming into a blank market that has no kind of pressures, no demand pressures, no sorts of amenity-driven types of supply and production. They're coming into markets that have some kind of a movement. They're coming into markets that are changing. There are pressures, and so from my standpoint, it's not that there is a causal relationship between apartment projects and subsequent changes in housing values. It is that the housing values were already somewhat at a premium in those areas. That's why the apartment projects got built in many cases. But still, Councilman Franks, your question, though, is apropos to that kind of analysis, because then we'd want to actually look at the types of projects that were being built and see whether or not that is kind of the relationship. So the summary of the other amenities, schools, parks, full-service restaurants, they're generally all in the 1% to and then the schools and some of the parks between the 10 and the 20 and 30%. The question is this an indication of demand? Is this an indication of preference? So there is a what we're going to get into in this next section of the slide presentation is an indication of respondents' preferences for community features, for amenities, for other things. And so the question is, as we reflect back on the supply analysis, are these an indication that demand pressures have actually built around these features, these community attributes, such that the premiums have escalated? That is that's my hypothesis. So what's the outlook for demand of these housing characteristics or these community characteristics? And that's where we want to go. So preference, we're going to look at a couple different things. So in these survey results, I've tried to extract the really interesting distinctions between responses by generation, by age category, and by tenure. So owner-renter, age 35 and younger, which is generally the millennials, 35 to 54, and then 55 plus. So in order to prevent there being too many of these age categories, you just parsed it into 3. And then I wanted to look at the service industry and rental inventory connection. That was also, I can't remember whose question that was last time, but we did have a question about that. So just an overview who we're surveying. They're Lakewood and non-Lakewood residents because they are all employed in Lakewood. Some of them are living in Lakewood. Obviously, some are living elsewhere in the metro area. Some are longtime residents. In fact, 2/5 of the respondents have lived in Lakewood for more than 20 years. And a quarter of them have actually lived in Lakewood for less than 5 years, which I think is a really good response rate for newcomers. The owner-renter split is 78-22. Nanette asked me a couple days ago whether or not these results were statistically valid in the traditional sense, and I told her they are not, because they are not representative of Lakewood's tenure breakdown at the moment. They have not been weighted. So we would ordinarily weight them by age, because younger people these days are too distracted by their iPhones and iPads to do anything like that involves community involvement. Income levels, typically you get more people participating. That was not a dig on you. Of course, I'm not under 35. Unless you are, it's not a dig. All right, well, pardon my digs then. You're obviously more engaged publicly because you're sitting right here. So we're looking at incomes, and we're looking at all household types. So adults living alone, single parents with and without children, empty nesters, unrelated roommates, and obviously families. The simple answer is that no, these results are not statistically valid at the moment because they haven't been corrected and weighted for tenure, age, and income. But the reality is we've got a mix in this survey population. We've got Lakewood residents and non-Lakewood residents. What we're looking at here is a sample of the employment base. So it wouldn't be that in this case we'd actually be looking at if we were taking that population and correcting it to something to make it statistically valid, we'd actually be correcting it to the workforce. So the workforce is likely to be more weighted on the upper incomes, more weighted on the ownership side, and more weighted on the upper age level side as well. Nevertheless, the weighting process is still something that we'll do later on. All right, so I'm not going to read all these, but this is a selection of questions that we have asked in a PDF format. It was about a 4 to 6 page survey, depending on whether or not the respondents received the version with the visual preference survey or not. but there were a lot of questions that have to do with a lot of different things. So neighborhood type preference. First question here is, which of the following types of neighborhoods do you prefer? And the second question is, which is more important to you in deciding where to live? These two questions come from surveys that have been conducted over the last couple decades by the National Association of Realtors, Association of Home Builders. We've adapted these over time to include them in all of our community preference surveys so we can find where there's alignment. Generally speaking, there's always alignment no matter which community we're surveying. So the first one is, the answer to the question was, which of the following types of neighborhoods would you prefer? Would you prefer to live in a neighborhood where you had to drive to get to everything and you lived in a larger home on a larger lot? This is the response by age category. I'll just let you kind of take it in. The second one is, you'd like to walk to all the amenities and prefer to live in a smaller house in a smaller lot. And you can see the reverse trend here. And then there are people with no preference, or people who simply wanted to abstain and create noise in the results. The second one is, which is more important to you in deciding where to live? The size of the home or the neighborhood? There's generally no distinction between age groups here. But of course, there are always people who prefer to indicate other. I didn't have access to the other responses. I can tell you from previous surveys that some people don't always read every one of the words in the questions, because I've seen open-ended responses such as, I prefer the neighborhood to making my decision, or the size of a home, and that's their other response. But there are other people who have very specific things that actually fall into the category of what makes a neighborhood. All right, so here's an interesting question that falls into a matrix of responses. I did not break this down by age group because it would have been too difficult to go through. Although I do pull out a couple of these for following slides. So in choosing a place to live, how important are the following considerations to you currently and then in 5 years? So home size, low maintenance, privacy, quality, cost, schools, historic character, good sidewalks, safety, all the way down to walking to a number of amenities. And you can just kind of look at this list. We can flip back to this later. The percentage here indicates the percentage of people who indicated that in choosing a place to live, that was the most important consideration. So a lot of people choose cost. In fact, I think safety is the number one at 75%, followed by cost, and then quality is at 50%. Short commute to work is 49%, then well-designed sidewalks. Every community we've surveyed has been different in this type of a thing, except for the safety. Safety is always number one. So then in the next 5 years, that changes. So home size might become increasingly important for some people. Low maintenance, privacy, quality, cost. Public schools is about the same. Historic character is about the same. Sidewalks, roughly the same. Safety, yet higher. Range of housing types. Short commute to work is actually down. Walking to schools, shops, rail, and to parks and recreation. We can come back to this later on. But these are selected preferences by age. So the desirability of living within walking distance of light rail. This one was actually pretty interesting. And the second one is, how important is the sense of privacy to you currently? So the desirability of living within walking distance of light rail is actually really high. These are the responses for people who indicated extremely and very desirable. 83% of people under 35, down to 66% over 55. And then how important is the sense of privacy to you? Increasingly important as the ages increase. So here are those 6 images that I showed you last time. and the desirability of these housing types. This one is a fun one. I just summarized some of these. These are not comprehensive responses. So the overall numbers here are on a scale of -5 to +5 is a desirability scale. So extremely undesirable is a -5. So we asked people to rate all of these images on a scale of -5 to +5. And what I'm showing in the percentage is 82% of people viewed these images positively. That is anything from +1 to +5. So the single family detached home, positive 82%. Average rating 2.9. So some people viewed it negatively, others viewed it more clearly more positively. The interesting thing was, so there's alignment with the owners under 35 and the 35 to 54-year-olds, with 83 to 85% of them indicating a positive desirability to that, average rating of 3.1. Renters seeing that somewhat less desirable with an average rating of 2.4, but still positive. Next one is a small lot single family. Overall, I think these are also in declining rank of desirability, as you might imagine. Single family detached has always been and probably always will be the most desirable housing product out there. Single family detached, single family, the small lot is increasingly so. So that here, renters and under 35 viewed at 83 to 88% positively, whereas owners and those over 55 didn't like it nearly as much, but still around that average. The duplex was pretty low. Overall, 35% positive ranking, generally a -0.7 on the scale of desirability. Renters and those under 35 viewing it more positively than owners and those over 55. The low-rise multifamily is still lower, an average rating of -1.5. Renters and under 35 viewing it more positively, and owners and those over 55 viewing it far less positively, in fact, generally negatively. There are a couple of statements to make here. One is it's always a difficulty in selecting the actual images to go into these that encapsulate and characterize the typical duplex or the typical low-rise multifamily unit. And it's also it's also a problem in a sense that there's always survey bias. There's respondent bias in their understanding of what this product is and where it has traditionally been located. Because in most people's experience, they've seen projects built in really bad locations, and some people have seen projects built in good locations. Nevertheless, we go down the line to the mid-rise, number one, and that has an increasingly negative view, but renters and those under 35 viewing it positively. More positively, but yet negatively still, and those over 55 less so. The high-rise, or the mid-rise 2 type, actually gets a somewhat higher rating, relatively speaking, with renters and under 35s viewing it not as negatively as that other mid-rise product, and then the 55 plus viewing it slightly more positively, but still quite negatively. As opposed to the mid-rise type number 2. So we'll depart from that for the time being and go to a couple other preferences. These two, how important is having a range of housing types in your neighborhood? So as we think about all those housing types, and we think about whether they are walkable, this is a breakdown by age. This is really interesting. This was not the result I expected from this age breakdown for this question. How important is having a range of housing types in your neighborhood? The trend, the pattern is increasingly important for the older age categories as opposed to being the other way around. And then how important is being able to walk to shops, restaurants, and entertainment? This was a response we were anticipating, with an increase of the younger generations being interested in being able to walk to those things. So future housing preferences, how does it change? If you're going to move to a different residence, would you anticipate moving to some type of a neighborhood? And the second question, where are you most likely to move in the next 1 to 5 years? So the first question was, would you rather move to an urban neighborhood where you can walk to everything, or would you rather move to a suburban neighborhood? So this is a bit of an internal consistency question to see if people are actually answering, consistently. And in some ways, people never answer consistently. It's kind of like a graduate school entrance exam where the questions repeat themselves and you find yourself answering variations on the same theme of a question, and you actually catch yourself in a wrong answer, or there are other things like the Foreign Service test that do these things to make sure that you're who you say you are and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I digress, but back to this. So if you're to move to a different residence, a third of each of these age categories actually said they would like to move to an urban neighborhood. But generally about half said they wanted to move to a suburban neighborhood, with more than half of the under 35s saying they wanted to move to a suburban neighborhood, which isn't the result we are expecting. So that's good for places like Lakewood, right? And then there are always people who don't know. And there are a lot of people who don't know on the 55 and older place. And there is something, I know that over the weekend you had a bit of information on aging from Dr. Cog, and you've discussed some of those things. I think one of the issues going on here is that there are not a lot of institutions and structures in place in the metro area to deal with this. And so as people over 55 are contemplating the next move, they don't know, because they don't know where they can go and receive the type of services and be in the type of proximity to amenities and services that they need. So in the next 1 to 5 years, where are you most likely to go? This result was also generally consistent with the results that you saw over the weekend, where it said, as I recall, 56% of people indicated they wanted to stay in their home. Our result was 58% overall, but with the breakdown here, as you see, between age categories. The other ones, though, are move within the West Denver metro area. So nearly 2/5 of those under 35 indicated they wanted to move somewhere within the West Denver metro area, but decreasingly so for the older age cohorts. Move outside of the West Denver metro area is generally low for all of them, and then don't know is, of course, higher on the millennial side because they're too distracted by their iPhones, Dig number 2. All right. Next one is mode of commuting. This is really interesting. Just look at, I didn't bother to do the little animation of the slides, but just look at this one for a second, and you point out to me where you see something that is really interesting. Yeah. I didn't really anticipate the response being like that, not for light rail. I mean, the current usage is 87% of people make their commuting either to and from work, to and from school, the soccer practice, the cliched things, by car. Carpooling is a fraction of the total commuting. Light rail, walking, biking, busing, other, I don't know what other is. Maybe some people actually put in moped or scooter and, thought they were being unique. But the preferred in the future really is interesting. It kind of shows, given that some of the previous results about living in proximity and walking distance to light rail and transit stops, seeing that people actually would like to do this in the future isn't so much isn't so much only a statement about wanting to do this. It's also a statement about where they want to live too. So it's a statement about transit access and the network of transportation as much as it is a preferred mode of commuting. So it's a land use It has a land use implication in terms of where housing is placed, and it has a transportation implication in terms of what areas get served with transit. I know that Fast Tracks doesn't have another line planned for, slicing down or bisecting Lakewood, for example, to go down to what is it, Bear Creek Run Park? What is the massive park? Yeah, Bear Creek Lake Park. So I know that there isn't another line planned there. I'm sure that people in Boulder would really be upset if that line got built before their line did. So we go on to future housing preferences. How important will quality of schools be to you in 5 years? And the second one was, how important will lower maintenance living be to you in 5 years? You might anticipate some of the answers here. All right, first is quality of schools will be very important to people under 35 in 5 years. And then lower maintenance will be very important to people over 55 in 5 years. A couple other questions. How important will walking to shops, restaurants, and entertainment be to you in 5 years? And how important will a short commute to work be to you in 5 years? First one is nearly unanimous response. People would generally like to be in walking distance to these amenities in 5 years. And commute to work, generally declining, but generally positive on the lower end of the age spectrum. So willingness to pay. So for all these are the last two slides of this section. How likely are you to pay more on housing to achieve a variety of these goals? To have your commute time, walk to shops, walk to work. So all these percentages indicate that this number of the respondents would be willing to pay 10% more for their housing per month, which would mean either rent or their mortgage payment, to be able to cut their commute time in half, to be able to walk to shops, to walk to work, to have higher quality schools, walk to light rail, live in your daycare facilities. The component to that is that we asked people also about 20%, so a bit of an elasticity of demand. This is 15% would demand that their commute time be cut in half, and they'd be willing to pay for it. 15% would like to walk to shops, restaurants, and entertainment, and be able to pay for it. How many of those people, or what portion of those people would still want to pay 20% more if they could achieve that goal? And so on a general, it's about 21%. So commute time drops to about 11%. Walking to shops drops from 15 to 12. Walking to work drops from 15 to 10, 20 to 10, 13 to 8, and 4 to 2 in these. So there is a general trend downward, as you might expect, but obviously it's not a one-to-one. It's not a linear relationship between the demand for housing and a person's willingness to pay. And the last one, how likely are you to pay 10% more in housing to half your commute time, and how likely are you to pay 10% more in housing to be able to walk to shops? I wanted to break these down by age to show that more of the younger age cohort are willing to pay 10% more in housing to cut their commute time in half. And also more of the younger generation are also willing to pay 10% more in housing to walk to shops. That means that if we parse their results down by are you willing to pay 20% more, those numbers are still pretty sizable portions. So we go back to a little bit of the demand side for just 4 more slides to look at the connection between the retail and service sectors and housing affordability in terms of the rental market. This was just dipping our toe into this. This is a response to another question from the last session. So this is the number of jobs per industry by two-digit NAICS for the year 2001. This is the change to 2015, where there are 1,600 more jobs in the retail sector, which is the focus of this analysis. I also wanted to highlight that there were 6,900 more jobs in healthcare. They have an average salary of $47,000. The average salary for wage and salary workers in the city is about $59,000. So they are still at about 80% AMI, to use that nomenclature from the beginning. So what I did was I looked at the distribution of households of those working in the retail and service sector workforce by their income level. And here's where I've got those AMI breakdowns again. Now I converted I converted about 15,000 or so jobs into 8,700 households by aligning the jobs per household number so that the weighted average of the median household income for this group equaled the median household income for all renters. So I've calibrated this so that it is representative of the rental workforce. And so the rental workforce, the workforce that is in rental housing is distributed in this pattern, or was in 2000, and is distributed like this, a little bit more positively on the upper end of this of the spectrum by 2015, where the median income for these households was about $45,800 for 9,900 households. So the idea is to look at all of the apartments in the city and to look at what their average rents are, the distribution of rents. This coincidentally represents all. It represents about 56% of the estimated total rental inventory. As you might know, of course, there are a lot of duplexes, single-family homes in the rental inventory, which are not captured by CoStar data. And CoStar, which acquired Apartments.com about a year ago, makes everything, all the data accessible for projects that contain, I believe, 30 or maybe 50 or more units. So the cutoff is missing a lot of the inventory as well below that. But still, it's 15,200 units represented in this inventory with an average rent of $1,010 per month. This is the distribution of apartments by income level. So using those same AMI levels, this is the distribution of rental inventory. That's the distribution of service sector households. And so that's an indication of generally where things might be. You could call them undersupplied. This is where you could call them oversupplied. What this illustrates is common, or I should say it's not uncommon, to have an imbalance of the supply and demand components for the rental market, because it's very difficult, if not impossible, to build anything market rate below 80% AMI. That's why tax credit projects exist to build projects at 60% of AMI and lower. So there's always going to be an undersupply of units at those lower income levels. So so that's why in terms of cost burden, when you look at metrics citywide, there is always a greater portion of households in lower income levels for renters that are cost burden than there are on the owner's side. Because the owner's side is going to be represented by a lot of people who have paid off their mortgages or are on fixed incomes and are in a house that they've already paid off. So there are still more slides. Is everybody okay to go on? Okay. All right, so this one, I want to talk about some supply-demand components and the influence of those supply-demand components on price and quantity. All right. Might want to crack your knuckles. Get ready for this one. So this one is a slide that I've put together over a long period of time. I've revised this for all of you so that we might be able to use this at later stages as a reference point for talking about what we have purview over, what we don't have purview over, where connections and linkages are between various supply and demand components, and what type of influence or leverage can be asserted on them. So I've broken down supply into three components, and this is based on literature reviews in the past, talking to other people, talking to colleagues, other professionals in the industry, how they think about things, publications, et cetera, all those things, broken it down into construction costs, land use controls, and community features on the supply side. So under construction costs, there are 5 components which also branch off into yet more subcomponents that I haven't put up on here. So construction costs, materials, land and infrastructure, labor, Soft costs, which is a long list from insurance, legal, architectural, accounting, et cetera, and financing terms. Land use controls is pretty basic: regulatory environment and zoning. So the regulatory environment can be in addition to zoning, as you know. Community features is infrastructure. Available inventory, I'm lumping available inventory under community features because it's not a part of what's being constructed in terms of the supply. It is a part of the kind of the type of sort of geographic feature class of a community, if you will. A lot of people are attracted to certain areas because of their quaint historic character. The housing itself is an amenity. It's a community feature. So that's why I put it under here. And amenities. Amenities being parks, trails, open space, all the things we've been talking about. The demand side is broken also down into 3 components: quality of life preferences, household formation, and financial influences. So under quality of life preferences, this is, again, all those preferences we've been talking about. Housing characteristics, parks, trails, open space, all the way down to employment and transportation. Household formation is population growth, so it is natural population growth plus net migration and or just in-migration, and it's job growth. Those are really main components of demand. We talked about that last time in terms of the main components of demand. And then the financial influences are access to down payment, household income, borrowing terms, and alternative investment return. So the alternative investment return in this case is thrown on here because the demand side is also where if you've got a buyer for a rental project, you have an investor essentially making a decision that is a demand side decision, as well as investors making decisions on the supply side, because someone is building it and someone is acquiring it after stabilization. So I want to point out a couple linkages between a number of these things. One is building form, available inventory, and housing characteristics. So building form is one of those standard things that all of you have in your purview to look at, and everybody behind me is interested in looking at building form and making the built environment a nice place to live. But that crosses between supply and demand. Another place where there is great intersection between supply and demand influences is through planning and economic development. You plan for parks. People like parks. You plan for where to put shopping. You put Belmar where it is. People like shopping. People like access to places like that. Dining. You hope that restaurants enter into, develop or open shop in certain corridors. People like that. Employment, you have a supply of existing employers. There are decisions that get made about where to locate new businesses because of where other businesses already exist. So employment is both a supply side consideration and a demand side consideration, because people who get jobs turn around and then want to live there and buy housing. Entertainment and transportation. Again, transportation is a public good and service that is both supplied, that makes an area attractive, and as you can see by those age level breakdowns, an increasing number of people, younger ages, are wanting to have access to light rail. It's their preferred, 44% say it's their preferred mode of transportation in the future, and so on. But on the other hand, it's also something that actually is it. It's the demand side component and the supply side. The other one is the general business needs and demand. So employment on the supply side and job growth are facilitated by general business needs. So businesses need labor and they need inputs. And so that contributes to both the demand for job growth and the availability of jobs for an area. So the availability of jobs creates demand for housing, and the need for greater business activity creates demand for more jobs. So it's a bit of a circular effect. There's something we'll come back to later in terms of cost burden that relates directly to this. We did talk about cost burden again last time, but in terms of that that cycle of the effect of cost burden on businesses. If people are paying too much in their housing, it translates to not as much being spent on retail, which impacts retail businesses, service sector jobs, and that means fewer jobs. If people didn't spend as much on their housing, or spent a more efficient amount on their housing and an optimal amount were circulated back into the economy, it would actually stimulate job growth. The last one is wage structures. Wage structures affects, again, the supply and demand side. I put this on here just to show a couple other linkages. This is one that's not really in your purview, although some city councils around the country have taken it upon themselves to try to affect change in this regard. Some states have as well. But that affects supply and demand as well. And then there is the financing terms, borrowing terms, and alternative investment return, which is at the bottom, affected by the federal funds rate, basically. So there are a number of things that fall within your purview, and I failed to highlight these in my graphic, but I'm going to make a note of them now. So they are land and infrastructure, soft costs such as potentially insurance, legal, obviously the regulatory environment and zoning are in your purview, infrastructure, and all of those amenities are within council's purview, and those generally fall all on the supply side. Of course, the fact that the amenities, the planning and economic development issues, this is basically why the housing study is being conducted. There is an intersection, and this is the intersection between the supply and the demand side. And it is probably one of the more critical ones. The conventional approaches are to address infrastructure, land, and zoning, and the regulatory environment. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But first, I want to go through a bit of an illustration of the price-quantity effects of supply and demand side. So here is the price-quantity graph with supply curve and demand curve. So optimal price, theoretically, is the intersection of the two curves. What we're dealing with in a market that has excess demand is a higher demand curve, a shifted demand curve, such that there are more buyers in the market, there's a higher willingness to pay, there are low mortgage interest rates, and there is generally income and wage growth. So what that does is it increases the price, it increases the producer's desire to produce in quantity. Depending on how those demand curves are drawn, the quantity can either stay the same or increase slightly. The supply curve that we're dealing with in this type of a market is also heightened. So we have land supply constraints. As we noted last time, the city of Lakewood is nearly built out. I don't know really of many acreages of land that can be developed for the conventional type of development that you had in the last 100 years. But we've got supply constraints, inventory constraints. There are increased cost to build. That is, the inputs to construction have increased. Material costs have increased greater than CPI. Labor costs have increased also greater than CPI. And there are also labor shortages, which is a serious problem that we're dealing with in this state. And we also get regulatory influences on raising the supply curve. Inclusionary zoning, linkage fees, effectively are like a tax on development. They create they increase the supply curve, and so that it actually increases the price and lowers the quantity theoretically of what's produced. So the idea in typical policy discussions is that you want to try to lower the supply curve. Again, like the previous graphic I showed, most of what you have purview over is on the supply side, not the demand side. So the attempt is you don't manipulate the demand side. You don't want to shut the door, or do you, to people moving into Lakewood. you don't want to, there isn't anything you can really do to get more people in. You can work on economic development, you can work on business attraction and retention, but then you'll still run into a supply side problem, and then that will also exacerbate the price as well. But traditionally, cities go for lowering the supply curve with subsidies, additional density, land, fee waivers, et cetera. That's, in theory, supposed to lower the price and raise the quantity. So there is this kind of imbalance of supply and demand. In Colorado, there are 2.1 million households, or there were in 2014. 670,000 of them are cost burdened. How much should they be spending? How much are they spending? What's the difference between them? Little math. The answer is that cost burden in terms of an imbalance of supply and demand is actually resulting in households in the state spending $3.4 billion above their 30% that they should be spending on housing. So $3.4 billion is about 1.1% of the state's GRP. And if that money were still in the pockets of households, it would amount to about $1.2 billion in retail spending, which would generate another $35 million in a year in just state sales tax revenues. Last time I talked to the guys at the state budget office, we're facing a very serious fiscal problem in the next 5 years. And locally, this is what it would look like. So locally, there are 226,000 households. In Jefferson County, 68,000 of them are cost burdened. That spending amounts to $387 million in 2015, above their 30%. So if this were still in the pockets of Jefferson County households, it would amount to about $135.8 million in retail spending per year, based on that 2015 statistic. Now, granted, these numbers change over time, based on a lot of market conditions. So we're going to step into some perceptions, and this is the last part of the slide presentation. I might make it to 90 minutes with this. Actually, I might not, because I think it started a little bit late. So where are we going? This is back to some of the survey responses, and I want to throw these in before we get into the general kind of policy setup. We're not going to engage in the policy discussion now. This is just to kind of set the framework for how to think about it, and we'll come back to that discussion at a later date. So perceptions of the people surveyed, thinking about efforts to provide a wide range of housing options on the Front Range, would you say that things are going in the right direction, or have they gotten off on the wrong track? This is the percent of people by age that think it's going in the right direction. These are the people who think it's gotten off on the wrong track. Again, my dig at millennials is that they're not reading the newspapers enough to read about what's going on in the metro area. Of course, Councilor Gutwein is an exception to that. But generally speaking, I even have a problem with some of my colleagues in the office who are in that age category who don't read the local paper and prefer to just read the New York Times. And I say to them, as much as the Denver Post is a, substandard newspaper, it still is important to know what's going on in the region. And anyway, so this is where people stand. Yeah. So this is the percent of people who don't know. Again, there's another dig at millennials there. But still, just to review these things, right direction in terms of where housing is going, wrong track, and don't know. Now, the wrong track is a qualitative response. That could mean a qualitative response that it's going in the wrong direction, as in Denver has gone in the wrong direction in enacting a commercial and a residential linkage program. The wrong direction could also be that other cities like Longmont have opted not to do anything about it and just to continue to study the issue. So wrong direction and wrong track could be taken either way in this case. We'll see when we get to the open-ended responses what people have to say who said wrong track. All right, next one is, where should government priorities be? What are your areas of highest government priority? Answers reflect a percent of the respondents selecting each topic as their number one rank. So this is a combined ranking. Everybody ranked 2 things. And so that means that all the numbers, the percentages you're going to see are not going to add up to 100% because everybody voted twice. And I think the responses represent 1,200 responses, so not everybody always responds to every question. Crime prevention, 53%. Reducing traffic congestion. So this is the percent of people who chose crime prevention as their top rank. I mean, any one of these. Infrastructure, 22%. Creating housing options attractive to me and my family. Wide variety of housing options. Planning and land use. Cities taking an active role with business attraction and retention. Building new amenities around light rail. I think that was it. Oh, I thought I had more. Sorry. My pacing was off because of it. How important are housing and infrastructure? All right. How important over the next 2 years is creating housing options for me and my family? I broke this question down by the age, and also over the next 2 years, how important is investing in infrastructure? Housing options. It's actually pretty important. So when you parse out the responses by what's important to people versus how it falls on the ranking schematic, it actually looks a little different, because my sense and experience with these kind of government priority responses is that, and we're seeing this at the national level with, again, a proposal to increase defense spending by, a great amount and decreases in everything else. This reaction is the effect of people who are so afraid of being attacked that we have to just spend more to prevent crime and all these things from happening, when in fact there are other things going on within our borders and within our geography that are actually more pressing issues, but that they are essentially it's masking what the real issues are. I would speculate, and we haven't looked at this data yet, that crime statistics in the city have not really increased such that people have this heightened sense of awareness that crime prevention is their #1 priority for all of you. My supposition is that statistics, we'll talk to the police department about what these look like. I could be wrong, but my suspicion is that they are tracking with either population growth. They could be also tracking with some other urban development issues, redevelopment issues, but that they are not growing exponentially such that it should actually be 53% chose this as a #1 ranking versus, say, infrastructure, which has a higher level of importance to people than some of the other numbers do, where all age groups agree that it's really important that government invest in infrastructure over the next 2 years, in spite of the fact that only 22% of people chose investing in infrastructure as their #1 priority. So you see what I'm saying about the disparity between this sort of, it's not a hypocrisy. It's a psychological sort of truism that the more people sort of wallow in their fear about what's going on without really knowing what's going on, the more they perceive that to be a problem. And in this case, the crime prevention statistic is the result of that, and the infrastructure is then falling down below. So how do we respond? There are different types of governments. There's a decision to make. 1, do something. 2, do nothing. Or 3, do something somewhere on the active to reactive spectrum. After all, Lakewood is in this evolving situation. Lakewood is not the community it was 50 years ago when the city of Denver was growing out of its own cowtown roots and becoming a city proper. And Lakewood was simply happily collecting a lot of the people who wanted a lifestyle. They wanted the suburban lifestyle, and it was not a great distance to commute. In fact, it's still not a great distance to commute. But the thing is that what we're dealing with now is an evolving situation where you've gone from a city that has been managing growth. So seeing the applications come in, making sure that they are conforming with code, and making sure that they're appealing developments and attractive developments so that you can continue to bring in people and bring in amenities and bring in services. Now you're encountering more urban and redevelopment issues. Now you're encountering more revitalization concerns. Now you're encountering more infrastructure needs. missing sidewalks, crumbling streets, transportation, a lot of other things that are now that all these things that were built during the growth period are now coming back to need more investment. So how do we respond? So there are a number of policies that seek to influence both the supply side and the demand side. As we think back again to that diagrammatic with the supply and the demand side, most fall on the supply side. Housing policy literature from everything from the Harvard Center of Joint Housing Studies to the Urban Institute to a number of other think tanks have characterized the progression or the evolution of housing policy considerations in terms of supply versus demand side. Most of the policies considered are supply side. There are far fewer on the demand side, but they are becoming increasingly important to consider. So we're not just talking about housing policy, though, in this case. We're talking about community development policy, where our infrastructure, streets, utilities, parks, libraries, schools, et cetera, are all a part of this. We're talking about economic development policy, business attraction and retention, and we're talking about fiscal policy, use of tax incentives and other tools. So on the supply side, there is the conventional building and administering housing, that is subsidized housing. That's tax credit projects. The goal is to achieve efficient production and administration. So there are three types of efficiency in policy directives. There's production, consumption, and administrative efficiencies. On the supply side is efficient production. So that means is that the economic value of producing a good, there is economic value of producing a good versus how much it costs to produce it. So that there is a value that is perceived economically, that is externally, compared to the value it costs to, or the amount it costs to produce that unit. So that's production efficiency. And then there's administrative efficiency. So in the case of subsidized housing, there is also the amount spent on program management and administration as opposed to just the program itself. So there are other types of programs out there other types of policies that take investment to establish itself, and there are also costs for ongoing maintenance of that program through labor, through input, through financial resources. On the demand side, there is the idea that you create policies that stimulate an attractive built environment or basically give full range of households the ability to participate in the market. Actually, that's not one or the other. These are the two types of policy possibilities. So either on the supply side, you're subsidizing housing, or on the demand side, you're subsidizing people or households. So the goal is here to achieve efficient consumption of goods and services or housing. That is, that the value that a household places on the good or the housing is equivalent to its market pricing. So that is where, that also speaks back to kind of where rental projects are placed, where ownership projects are built. They are put in places where developer perceives that there is a consumption efficiency, that the market for demand, the market for housing in that location is sufficient compared to what it can be priced at. So that's a production consideration for the purpose of consumption efficiency. All right, so the typical supply-side approaches fall into three categories: development-based, conventional, and community-based approaches. I'm just going to let you peruse these just really briefly. There are the standard types of policies under the development-based approaches to the community-based approaches, which are a local, like Denver has just done with the housing fund. The $150 million is establish a time-limited property tax that is going to, in part, fund the $150 million over 10 years. It's a an example of a community-based approach. Seattle is probably one of the better examples from around the country that has done this about 5 times for 7-year housing levies. Sales taxes have also been used, lodging taxes, permanent housing trust funds have also been used. But in approaching how to use or how to look at these things, I think the first thing is to take inventory of what the available options are in terms of a few questions. Number one, what's in your purview to address? Can you leverage any resources, and do you have political will? So I took the time, I don't know, a couple of years ago to put this thing together, to think about how much political will it took actually to establish some of these different policies versus how much economic leverage was needed to actually achieve these types of programs. Fee deferrals don't take a lot of economic leverage. They don't take a lot of political will to say, yes, we're going to establish fee deferrals. Fee waivers take a little more because they also require a lot more economic leverage. You have to have funding in reserve, or you have to have some ability to offset the cost to pay for the fee waivers. So there's a little more on the will side and a little more on the leverage side as well. General fund allocation, a lot more political will. Dedicated taxes, extremely high in the political will, high in the economic leverage scale. Next one is, I think it's important to know where you are and what resources can be leveraged. Again, you're either in a position to be managing growth, or you're in a position to be looking at revitalization and redevelopment. Different types of leverage can be financial resources, entitlements, leveraging actually demand pressures, and partnerships. So community falls into any number of quadrants. So on the growth spectrum and on the economic resource spectrum. So you're a high growth, low resource community, you're a high growth, high resource community, or a low growth, low resource community. It's important to know where those are in order to think about what types of tools and policies are going to be effective. And effective and efficient is actually another one of those sort of conjugates. So leverage is efficient where there is an intersection between two things. One is what is valued by the consumer, and two, where, or actually it's A and B, but A, what's valued by the consumer, and B, what a community or a producer has to offer. So that means if you're going to if you're going to try to establish a policy, or you're looking at a policy. And by the way, these examples are all in the construct of housing policy. I didn't want to try to generalize this too much for all the types of policies that are really in front of you. But the intersection of this is where, if there's intersection between A and B, where what is valuable to a consumer, in this case it could be a developer of a project, and what a community has to offer, it could be density. And that would mean that demand is exceeding the supply, or demand is exceeding the highest and best use that entitlement would allow. That means a community has leverage if the demand has exceeded the supply constraint for that geography or that market. Which means there is leverage for the community to use such a policy. If there is no intersection, in the case of say a place like Davis, California, which is just west of Sacramento, nice college town, pretty, with an urban growth boundary and everything like that. But still, nobody ever maxed out their entitlements. They had the zoning was probably 3 times in excess of what most developments developed to. So when they tried to leverage density or height as an incentive, it never worked. Nobody took advantage of it because it wasn't efficient to the producer. Or in fact, this case, to the developer, who is the consumer of that good. There are other considerations for whether you're in a slow growth geography, so it may be lower local proportion of growth to the region that is the problem. So I haven't really presented you with numbers as to whether employment in the city of Lakewood is growing at a slower rate than it is in the Denver metro area. That might be a consideration. I haven't presented you with numbers yet that illustrate whether population growth is lower in proportion to population growth at the metro region either. And then other considerations are deficiencies in other goods and services. The reason being is that perhaps it's not leverage in additional policy, but a leverage of additional assets that is sometimes the need. So here is their political will and a vision. Vision is like your comprehensive plan. You have a beautiful comprehensive plan with a lot of goals and a lot of action items. That is, as you might think of it, your working document. It is your guiding document for all things city planning. I'm showing a picture here of the city of, does anybody know? Yes. How did you know? Oh, because it says right there. I planted that there just for you. This is a view of Indianapolis from one of my favorite restaurants in the city, the Ratskeller, which is an old German restaurant that has some of the best German food in North America. I can tell you that. But Indianapolis had a vision. The mayor had a vision 25, 30 years ago. So I grew up, I'm from Gary, Indiana, and I knew about a place called Indianapolis. Some of my cousins lived there. My uncle lived there. And we knew about, back then, we knew about what, I can't even remember the guy's name. The mayor had a great vision to revitalize downtown. It was a pretty, you can remember who?
Was it Dennis Kucinich?
No, Kucinich was in Ohio.
I think it was, he became Bloomberg's
Yes.
deputy mayor.
Yeah, I can't remember. Anyway, I'm sure somebody with an iPhone can find it out real fast. Anyway, the point is, so Indianapolis had a vision to revitalize its downtown, and it has done a really fantastic job. It is a pleasant place to visit. Although it is, it's not as big a city as Denver is. It is a really nice place. They've got a river walk, a river downtown. They've got a couple stadiums in the area. They've got lots of restaurants and districts around. There was a vision. The point is, there was a vision. So this is as far as I'm going to go with a motivational speech tonight. So again, the decision is do something or nothing. Or you're going to do something somewhere on the active-reactive spectrum. Again, you've got an evolving situation. You have an opportunity to place a vision in front of you that is commensurate or that proportional with the situation you're in. So we've got a couple of quotes from people. So how do we respond? Benjamin Franklin said, "Diligence is the mother of good luck." I thought this was a really fantastic quote because some people would like to just sort of sit back and take a kind of a passive stance to the evolution of a city. Yes, some people have good luck, but a lot of cities around the country have not just become great places on good luck alone. In fact, the only ones that have become great cities are the ones that have arguably always been those kind of great cities, the coastal cities. New York, for all of its grit and grime and crime and everything, has always been a great city. It doesn't take a mayor to make that city great. But everybody else inside of the coastal areas needs also some kind of a vision. You need a vision, which is the diligence that produces the luck. At least Ben Franklin believed that. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that shallow men believe in luck and that strong men believe in cause and effect. And Frank Sinatra said that luck is only important insofar as getting a chance to sell yourself at the right moment. After that, you have to have the talent and the know-how to use it. Meaning that you have to be in the right place at the right time to get heard, but you have to have talent, i.e. you have to have the tools and information and the understanding and the vision to make it move forward. So my motivational speech is over. All right, last few slides. So who do we typically return to for resources? Historically, people have turned to the federal, this is back to the housing policy kind of context. These are federal outlays from the Office of Management and Budget. So these are the numbers are actually on the left-hand column are the totals which conform to this line you're seeing here are in millions of millions, which obviously are trillions. So the current number, well, the 2016 number was the federal outlays of nearly $4 trillion. This is total community and regional development outlays, historic and estimated. So I know that the budget proposal just came out. and that this is actually not too far off from what was anticipated, although it is a great decrease in that. So federal outlays for community and regional development has gone from 27.8 billion is going to be about halved in the next 6 years. And that was an estimate that came out from OMB before the election. Next one is my estimate of how that's going to impact the state, and this was also done before the election. So I estimated that, so the top line is CDBG allocations, which are used for, as you may know, CDBG is used for supportive services, social services, housing counseling services, educational services, used for crime prevention services, recidivism prevention. It's used for infrastructure. In fact, almost all of the CDBG outlays to or awards that DOLA makes every year to rural communities that are not entitlement communities to CDBG funds themselves are for infrastructure projects. So this is one of the primary, if not the only source of infrastructure funding that a lot of communities have available to them, and that is estimated to drop by more than 50% over the next 10 years or so. And home dollars, which are the primary source of funding for construction, are also forecast to drop by more than 50%. I had a couple things here. Oh yeah, there are the numbers. And with the prospect of increasing cost to produce and less funding, it means you get far fewer units, of course. I wrote this slide before the election as well. The reality is a bit hopeful now. It should be somewhere in between. Can Congress really allow things to get this bad? We have yet to see on that. So what about state resources? The 9% projects are above and the 4% projects are below. So with this, I know that this is a presentation of some new information at the last part of this presentation, and one should never introduce new information at the end. But nevertheless, this is the number of units that have been produced with 9% tax credit allocations and 4% awards in the state of Colorado in the last 16 years. So you can see here at the end of the previous apartment cycle, there's the recession. Obviously, 4% projects are very market-driven because they effectively incorporate market units. And so when the market can't support it, as in the recession and the subsequent few years, nobody builds any 4% projects. And then here's where we are in the current cycle. So the projection of these, I did a little analysis with some data from my friends at Novogradac, the national accounting firm that does a lot of work with affordable housing developers, on the 9% tax credit volume in the state. So the trend is that this is the annual total tax credit that has been, or with the annual tax credit units that have been produced, there's been about an 8% increase in per unit funding over the last 16 years. So between 2000 and 2016, the actual amount of award in a 9% project has escalated at 8% per year. Think about that with respect to how much housing prices have escalated in the city of Lakewood over the last 16 years, which is about 2%. So if the award is increasing, that means the total cost to produce has been increasing because labor costs have been increasing and there are labor shortages. Now, the outlook is as shown here. Although the amount of tax credit, the amount of tax credit volume may be increasing over time because it's a congressionally supported formula. So back in, I think it was 2003, it was established that the tax credit volume would be identified at a certain dollar amount per tax credit and escalated every year afterward. So investors have typically been paying between 70 cents and a little more than $1 per tax credit to receive every dollar of their income tax credit. In the future, I anticipate that to go down somewhere in the neighborhood of the 85 cents range, which is more historical. And if state population continues to grow at about 1.5% and inflation grows at 2.2%, we're estimating that even though there's going to be about a doubling in the amount of 9% tax credit award dollars available, it will still only produce the same number of units that it has historically. So it's a long way of saying that even though state resources are expanding, it's not necessarily going to produce any more units in the future than it is right now, which means that every project that you try to pursue is going to become increasingly competitive. So, last slide. Next steps. We'll continue and finish up a number of the points of analysis that relate to our guiding questions. Where we go from here, another study session to look at a completion of the supply-demand analysis, a completion of the resident, non-resident survey results, and also a further effort to get a couple specific employers to participate with us so that we have really full major employer participation, and then also discussion of policies. So I hope that it's been helpful, if not really long, to go through some of this information, and I'll ask any questions you want. I can flip back to any of these slides as well.
I appreciate the it's a lot of information. It's good information, and I think once we have the opportunity to have all this so folks can go back through, we might see some more questions pop up in the next couple of days. One that I just want to make sure that we throw out and that we look at for the next is really the balance, and I think that's what some folks up here really want to understand. Are we overbuilding in certain areas? And what does that look like, especially as it relates to multifamily? And I thought that the one slide that you showed, it looks like we are pretty balanced as far as pricing and things that look like it. I forget, it was one of the early slides, but everything was pretty tight. We didn't have really outliers on either side of that. So it seems like we have a pretty healthy market. And I'm curious how that relates to maybe other communities in the metro, as far as, you know, that more stabilized look that you showed versus maybe some of our neighboring folks or even up north.
I haven't looked at any of the northern community numbers lately, but your central neighbors to your east are going to see that clearly rental markets have been overbuilt. That's the typical cycle. And as we looked at last time, as I illustrated the cycles of apartment construction activity, and rental vacancy rates and escalation in rental rates, they conform to this 10-year cycle. And every 10 years, the market overbuilds. Every 10 years after that, it stabilizes. Every 10 years after that, they go back to building and they overbuild again. It's the nature of the market. I don't actually believe that there's any way to decrease the volatility of that type of a market, because you have different investors participating with different investment interests. Or you have different producers participating with different investment interests, such as those who place their equity in construction, and then those who place their equity in maintenance, such as REITs. For the long term. So I would say that my intuition is that Lakewood has not overbuilt itself to the extent that, say, Denver likely has.
Well, and I think that's certainly a concern, something that we want to be cognizant of and make sure that we don't get there. But if we're creeping towards that, then that could be a policy discussion or a policy change that we could make to make sure, because there is quite a glut, I think, when you tour our neighbors to the east to see the different multifamily projects.
The only other thing that I'd add to that is that and this is a qualitative position on this, but I think that another concern really should be the quality of the construction that's going up. If it's an excess of units and it's coming in at the end of a cycle, I don't think it should be deterred at all. You need quality quality construction because it's good for the long run.
So then that leads into a discussion that this group also wants to have, and that's design standards and things like that that can elevate the quality. Great. Mr. Royball.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, thank you for that vibrant conversation here. I'm waiting to get my hands on a hard copy so I can, just read through it and kind of figure out what's going on. One quick question that I have that just popped up at the top of my brain sometimes is the social issues, the impacts of housing. For example, the homeless population. You have families that are at the verge of half a paycheck away from homeless, or used to be 2 paychecks. Now it's a quarter of a check. Now the wolves are at the door. And economically, they're saying, well, we need to figure out how we need to keep them there, or, figure out how to help them as much as we can. But we're having a lot of homeless issues throughout the city. And I was going to ask, is there any thought to that or any trends to it, or how can we help address those issues?
Well, the first document that is supposed to identify trends in homelessness and those types of needs is the consolidated plan. So Lakewood submits a consolidated plan every 5 years to be a recipient of entitlement funds, and so that document is supposed to contain a historical record of point-in-time survey data that would indicate how many homeless people and families and children, women, children, and have been counted on those certain nights. That's always a consideration in these types of issues. These are policies.
Now, one more question. Near and dear to my heart, veterans. How can we figure out how to figure out how many veterans are in Jefferson County, Lakewood? Is there any possible way to get some data on that?
I'm sure there is. Yeah. The census has data on, I believe the census has crosstabs by military service. So we can look at some historic data on that to the extent that it's available.
Okay, thank you. That's all I got.
Mr. Abel.
It's an amazing amount of information, and a lot of it seems to be to track pretty well. The one thing that I'm curious about is the survey. Do you have a margin of error for that? And can you go back to the slide that shows the folks who have certain lifestyle now but expect it to change in the next 5 years? Light rail especially, light rail bus use and that kind of thing. It is, there you go.
Modes of
sort
commute.
Thing.
Was it this one?
There you go. Okay. Bus and light rail, 2% currently use, and they expect in the coming future, in the near future, that they're going to increase that by 20 times.
These are people. These are respondents indicating that this is their preferred mode of commuting.
Sure. And right now they don't use it, but in a few years they expect to increase their use 20-fold.
Indicated that they
So,
would like to use it.
I understand that. How much credence do you give to something like that, where here's the actual rate, and then they say, but we're going to clean up our act and we're going to be much better at using mass transit, and 20-fold. That just doesn't seem to track. So again, is there a margin of error for that survey?
We'll use a margin of error when the survey results are final. so that when we get all the survey numbers in, we'll have a margin of error that can be applied to the results. But as far as the interpretation of surveys, they are a subjective interpretation. These are people's opinions. These are people's voiced preferences for what they want to do. They could say they want to do something right now, and something could happen in a year that changes their mind entirely. They could say, and that goes either way. So when I look at numbers like this, I think the interesting bit is the disparity or the differences between the two, as a statement on the current workforce's desire to want to use, say, light rail. They want to walk more. I mean, December 31st every year, a lot of people make New Year's resolutions. We could be taking a survey of people's New Year's resolutions here. In some ways, it is a community preference survey, so I think we should interpret it in light of what it is. It's a community preference survey, and take it for whatever we want it to be worth. I don't think that it's realistic that you can actually take this and say, well, now, so what is 44% of the population? Or 44% of the workforce? So compared to 2% of the workforce that currently uses it, and equate it with the West Line ridership, if we want to increase that so that 44% of the workforce is using it, would we actually have to have 2 West Lines? Probably, or more than that. So I don't think that it'd be a realistic application of these findings if we said the interpretation should be, well, we obviously need 2 more rail lines because there's no way we can get 44% of our workforce using the West Line if they are actually thinking about the West Line. They may be thinking, some of those people in the 44% who want to use it as a preferred mode in the future may have been a part of those people who actually want to move outside of the West Denver metro region. Maybe they want to move into Denver. Maybe they want to move up to, I don't know, the Weld County line so that they can take the North Metro commuter rail. I don't know. It really depends. You can parse those numbers down and really kind of see where it is. But I think that I think the gist of it is, right now, there are a lot more people who would like to be doing things differently than they are.
I understand that, and twice as many people would like to be carpooling. I understand that, and that seems to be within the realm of possibilities. But to increase that's doubling, but increasing something 20%. It's like my son was once asked what his favorite subject in school was. And he said, math. He hates math. I said, why'd you do that? He said, well, it sounds better than saying PE. So I kind of wonder if maybe we're dealing with that kind of thought.
We're always dealing with those kind of things. Always. Every single thing, every public opinion poll is marred and biased by those kind of things. There are people, in fact, who go and take surveys just to throw off survey responses. In fact, one of my clients did it once. Not this one, though. No, one of my clients actually did that to me once, and I found it before he told me that he had thrown off the responses, because I saw some anomalies in some of the crosstabs, and then I saw he had put Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and all these other outlier responses in that. And we try to clean up the responses and get rid of the riffraff who are just having fun cruising the streets, so to speak. But there's always the risk of these results being thrown off by that kind of survey taking.
So we shouldn't take them for absolute gospel.
No, this is not gospel. No.
Thank you.
No, this is community preference survey. Yeah.
Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. Did I understand that there's increased interest in small lot, single-family homes?
Yes.
You know what that reminds me of? Post-World War II. We're actually going to go back to that kind of housing product, I think. It sounds like it.
Yeah, it's a good historical parallel.
Right. And then, as far as the price of housing, my son recently was trying to buy a home, and they finally found a house that they liked. They were willing to give $5,000 over what the highest bid was, and they were turned down by somebody who had cash. And I am finding in our own neighborhood that houses are selling for cash, and it is actually taking out the younger families that would be willing to pay on a monthly basis. You can't compete with that. And just backing up what Charlie was saying regarding the light rail, I've found it a curiosity also when it talks about light rail as a preferred use in the future. That would mean that the people in Lakewood would be going downtown to work or else out to the hospital or Golden. There's a limitation of where the light rail will take you. And if you do take it downtown with the transfer and time, most people aren't willing to do that.
Right. That's right. There is of course, you have a lot of employment concentrated up along that west line with the Federal Center being out there. Mm-hmm. So I think because this is an employer survey, we're getting a lot of people who are stating they would like to be taking the west line out to their job and or the community college where they can easily do that. Because we're not right now talking about, we are talking about some people who live and work in Lakewood. We are talking about a lot of people who just work in Lakewood and live somewhere else, meaning that they would like to be taking the train out to those places of their work.
Just to comment on that, with the transit-oriented development that we've got, we're putting in clustering very high profile, high density, frankly, low-income housing. Those are not going to be the workforce for the Federal Center. I'm seeing a disconnect.
Well, they're not going to be the full spectrum. They're not certainly going to represent the full spectrum of the workforce, that's for sure. But they are representing a spectrum of the workforce that is essential for almost all of the employers around, which are service sector workforce.
That's right.
But you know, the
low-income type jobs.
Before it gets glossed over too much, I would like to pick up that point that you made, and I think you might have mentioned this in the last meeting. I did not bring it forward with this one, is the analysis of housing where sales have been by cash as a percent of all sales. I think that is a really interesting analysis to do. I don't know how conclusive it's going to be because we're limited to the realtors actually putting in the correct information about what kind of a sale it was.
There's a house around the corner from us that I believe sold for $365 cash. To me, I don't understand it, but yeah.
Ms. Shakti.
What does overbuilt mean? Like, yeah.
Supply exceeds demand.
So you're saying that, because my understanding is that the prices are too high in terms of, are you saying that in Denver they've built enough houses that the price has fallen?
Now there are a couple different things going on. There are two markets too. There's the ownership market and there's the rental market. And there is also the perception of the market in general. Last time we looked at a trend where the conclusion is that the Denver metro area is undersupplied in general. So that is all units, ownership and rental units, thus the increase of prices. So that's the effect on prices generally. In terms of the rental market, however, the only production that's going on right now, or about 60 65, 70% of it is in rental inventory well, say Denver proper, which is overbuilding for that specific market, meaning that anybody who wants to move here is forced into a rental situation temporarily until housing becomes available. So when we're talking about being overbuilt, it is either referring to a general location, or it can also refer to a specific market, a subsector of the market as well.
So are you saying if Denver had the amount of for sale that is ideal, they would have too much rental? But since they don't have the for sale, I mean, the prices for the rental properties aren't lower than optimal, right?
Well, it's hard to say what optimal.
Well, where you've got your lines in the graph.
That graphic was generally for the ownership market. I mean, it applies to the rental market if you equate price with rent. But in terms of the production of units for the market at large, when you say something is overbuilt, it's referring to that segment of the market. So because we're at the tail end of a rental market cycle, and because all rental market cycles end with it being overbuilt, we're going to see a subsequent period of time where rental rates do not escalate as fast as they have been for the last 7 to 10 years. But that doesn't
So it means that it's at a point where the developers won't be making money if they build more.
Exactly.
So it's based on the numbers at the beginning. It seemed like a whole lot of people are spending more than 30% of their income to pay for housing. So if there's extra supply of so one of the ways people deal with that issue is they try to build affordable housing, and it costs more to build the housing than people can pay for it, so the government chips in to build affordable housing. But this tends to be just a small impact on the whole need that's there. Is another thing that can happen that you have new supply of higher priced housing, and just the existence of more supply means that the prices come down for everybody, and is that?
The reality is that prices generally don't come down.
Or the rate of increase goes down.
It mitigates the impact. The simple answer to your question is that more supply always pulls back pressure, upward pressure on price. Always. It's a theoretical construct, and it's an observed reality. So whether or not you add rental or ownership housing to a market, it always alleviates pressure, the demand pressure, and alleviates pressure on upward pressure on the price for both rental and ownership. So that's why most policies have always tried to tackle supply side, because the theory is you add more units, you pull back pressures on the price side, because they're observing price escalating, and adding supply even at the high end means that it pulls back pressure somewhere in the middle.
And I guess, thank you. I understand better. And I think this came up before and will come up more in the discussions, but when we think of development, I think infill is attractive to me, but particularly infill in areas that need a little something. Like when like we have a bowling alley with nothing in it that's been there a long time, that kind of thing. And so what kind of policies might be targeted to those areas?
Might turn the question back around on you and everybody else. What kind of corridor studies have you done recently to assess the market for some of those areas? That's really what needs to, you really kind of need to understand what the market is capable of doing. If you've got underutilized properties, you need to inventory them. If they're sort of, if you've got a lot of vacant commercial space, underutilized, you've got a lot of parking lots, make a plan, figure out what to do with them.
Mr. Coop, you're done? All right. Ms. Gutwein?
Thank you. So a lot of information. I'm still kind of digesting everything. Thank you. Could we go back to the slide about, it had the image of the different kinds of housing. And I think this is along the lines of what Councilman Abel was asking. So I feel like this slide, some of the results are inconsistent with the other results that we saw. So we have, if you're going to live in a more walkable area, you're probably looking at, one of the more multifamily type homes and not the single family homes. But in the results, we saw that, millennials and seniors want those things. But then here we're seeing when they see the picture of it, they don't. And so my question is, what do you, is it the same answer, just all of those things are aspirational and the survey results, we have to take them for what they are? Or do you see something other than that that could explain this?
No, you've connected the dots appropriately. And it gets back to Councilman Abel's point about interpreting these results and asking how we should be interpreting these results. I find that in a lot of these, there are a number of questions that show that people always want to have their cake and eat it too. And the reality is you can't. The reality is you can't have small lot single family as much as people like the small lot single family generally as much as people like the traditional single family detached. But guess what? Unless you stack them on top of each other, not everybody's going to get that.
So I almost wonder if we would get more consistent results if we had, if it had a group of pictures with it, that the single family home, showed that it was far away from other things, and then the other home showed that it's right by the light rail.
Yeah, well, then we're getting into this modeling scenario of collecting data to prove economic theory of land value. Yeah.
So I guess my next question is, I realize that we're essentially kind of trying to ask people what they want, but what we need to understand is what they're actually going to do. And are there examples in other cities or data that we can look at that shows our millennials, our seniors actually purchasing and wanting these things that they're saying that they want? Like, are they moving into smaller homes?
So you want proof that people are actually doing what they're saying they're going to do.
I do.
That's a tall order.
Well, and do we have the product though? Like for our seniors though, for some of the folks we talk to, there's not a step down available unless they potentially move out of the city of Lakewood.
Right.
So that may not exist.
No, I don't believe that. I've never seen data like that.
Okay.
I've seen a lot of community preference surveys like this, and I think you're generally getting the appropriate sense for the value of a community preference survey and the extent to which you can apply and interpret its results. Obviously, there is no way, as much as some of my colleagues would love to ask 100,000 questions that get at every single angle of, showing them images of, would you like this small lot single family if you were one of 100 people bidding on that house in proximity to light rail? Or would you like to be one of only 2 people bidding on the rent for a product in one of those mid-rise units in proximity to light rail, where your likelihood of a monthly payment is going to be 30% less in the high-rise project than it is your mortgage payment on that small lot single family? we can't possibly ask every sort of eventuality-based question. It's impossible.
That's fair.
You can interpret it, though. You're fully licensed. All of you are licensed to interpret them as you want, though.
Okay, well, thank you.
I may not agree
I
with
wonder
it, but
if
you can interpret it.
In a
like,
general, if we're seeing millennials moving to cities and kind of more general conclusions like that. But I
so
understand
your,
that.
your question is kind of, what are millennials looking for? What are they willing to pay for? What are seniors looking for? What are they willing to pay for?
Mm-hmm.
Are millennials doing it? Are seniors doing it? And the answer is always qualified. It always depends on really what's available. Are things really available that millennials want? Maybe the answer is largely no.
Mm-hmm.
Are things is a supply in proximity to amenities that seniors really want really available, such that we can actually analyze whether or not they're doing it? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think we have a perfect sort of a test environment to look at that.
That's fair. Thank you. Okay. And then I guess my other question is something that we talked about at our retreat this weekend was higher quality design standards, sustainability standards. And those things would affect the supply side, it sounds like, but they could potentially increase the cost of development. And so how are we going to impact
I'm sorry,
housing
say that
costs?
again. You're saying that
So I want
the
to
cost of-
increase
to-
sustainability standards,
Yeah.
and I would like to see higher architectural standards. But is that going to lead to higher housing costs and kind of exacerbate the problem that we have of no affordable housing?
it depends on what kind of sustainability standards you're talking about implementing, or whether you're talking about design standards that include certain architectural features or landscaping features or other conventional site development type of considerations in development in general, as to whether or not those are the actual amenities that people are wanting. And if they are, if it is proximity to dining or proximity to grocery, for example, and you've got a design standard that governs how you approach master planned communities, if in the case that you've got a spare Stapleton sitting around that you want to redevelop, or a Lowry Air Force Base, there are ways to approach designing and considering the layout of land uses that isn't just the traditional single use type of a development. So, the kind of historical perspective on the city. Most of the developments that have occurred in the city in the past 30, 40 to 50 years have been single-use developments, just residential product, because that's what people wanted. They wanted to drive their big boats back down to Denver to work, and drive them back to park in their beautiful driveway and their beautiful lot with their beautiful house. But things have changed now, and people want some amenities that are closer.
Thank you. And my last question is, was the mayor A, Stephen Goldsmith, B, Bill Hudnut, or C, my millennial skills are not good enough?
A.
A. Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Vincent.
I can't top
Like
that.
Jeopardy.
Jeez. I do want to go back a little bit, though, to the data and some things that I'm trying to get my arms around. Folks said that they would pay more for good quality schools. Is there any comparison, if the rest of the council feels it's worthwhile, to do affordable housing in areas in relationship to good quality schools? Because from what I eyeballed, I think there may be a relationship. And
I'd be asking, essentially, if we have more affordable housing in an area,
is it
the
X,
school
Y,
doing-
Z?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are the schools poorer? Are they further away from grocery stores? because I saw a swatch of data, which, and there was a comment made, it was, oh, that's all in our area.
We could correlate that with our Title I's.
Is that what you're doing?
Any data, any additional data that we have on the schools, I didn't have it in this data set, but any additional data there is that we could use to categorize things, we can look at.
Because I think the constituents out there, at least those that I represent a lot, have a theory that more multifamily units, older stocks of housing and apartments equate to schools, not high-performing Title I schools. From what I just saw here loosely, there may be some validity in that. So I'd kind of like to see if that's...
We can try to look at it to the extent that it's a valuable effort. Depends on what the objective is. What kind of an objective do you see in that analysis?
And anybody can help me here. What I see at it is a lower housing stock brings in lower income. Too many, I don't know how to say this, but a lot of Title I kids, which cause people to move into other areas of Lakewood,
Maybe
where the schools are higher quality, there's more single-family stock, and higher income level.
Well, there's always a lot of movement in communities on the basis of schools.
But I think let me take a shot
Yeah,
at this.
please.
So
I
essentially,
think
if
you
we're looking to see if we have too much multifamily in an area, and we want to change, is it an opportunity to change the housing stock? So say an area is zoned for a lot of multifamily, and that's what we're seeing. But if we change that to townhomes or something less impactful, is there a correlation to potentially seeing better performance or better results at some of our elementary schools?
Okay.
That's what I was trying to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So is there an optimal housing mix
Right.
that correlates with performance of schools? There are a couple pieces of information that could go along with that. One of the things that strikes me is a study that I did with Douglas County about 8 years ago that we collected we were looking at impacts of the housing impacts with the school children generation rate impacts of different housing types. And the school district had collected data such that they knew the school-age children generation rates by every single housing type. Easier to do maybe in Douglas County, but maybe not so impossible to do with data here either. But it strikes me as something where I remember there being very big differentials in the school children generation rates of different housing types. And the generation rates for school-age children were generally pretty high with single-family units, because as I didn't show you every single result of the survey at this time, but there are a lot of results that say people, when their household type, they're anticipating household types changing. People are anticipating getting married. People are anticipating having children. People are anticipating, therefore, that they're going to make a move based on where there are high-quality public schools because of that. Or maybe their children are not school-age children at the moment, and so they're making decisions that are based on that. That kind of conforms with that general pattern. But I think that if we have some additional data that we can throw at this, there might be a good objective here.
And one other thing along with that, and it's just I do not know. I don't know what I don't know. But your housing prices went a quarter of a mile around high density. Did I read that? I think there's areas where high density, a quarter of a mile, is still high density from high density. So where does that quarter mile end? In other words, if I have a lot of high density right here and I go out a quarter of a mile around that and I still have high density, how far do I really go out from that center to find out what that is, where the income increase or the housing prices increase.
It's a geographic analysis that goes a quarter mile from the centroid, as it's called, of that data feature out. So it's kind of like saying you have the center of this room right here, or maybe it's right there, or maybe it's right there, and we're measuring a quarter mile at one point. So it's not going a quarter mile outside of a boundary. It depends on the data that we have. I mean, we can make a variation on it, but I see your point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ms. Franks?
And actually, mine's more of just a comment. If you can go back to the slide where it was showing the housing options, where it showed the house and the
images?
Yeah, the images. Yeah. And it's just to really illustrate a point. I mean, I think that in sometimes we get locked into kind of what is, and sometimes taking a more visionary approach would have been more interesting to me. I would have liked to have seen these bumped up against tiny houses, communal living, adjacent to horse properties, large lot, multi-generational mixed-use house and work complexes. That would have been more interesting to me to see some of those things bounced against these to see where people really landed, because those are some of the really creative solutions that then also drive interest, bring in new folks who have a different way of being and living. So those would have provided more interest than seeing the things that I've seen since I was born. I just wanted to comment on that maybe in the future, pull some of those in. That would have really, because we've got some areas where I think that there are some real opportunities and some real creativity for things that haven't been contemplated or visioned here. So I just wanted to point that out.
Well, that's a really good comment, and there probably is, aside from just the next time we do a community preference survey in a project, there more than likely is an opportunity that all of you have in the future to resurrect this list and expand on it, find appropriate pictures. You know, when you start talking about implementation and action on your comprehensive plan and community's development goals, and you start focusing in on different corridors or different markets, and you start thinking about what development opportunities are possible, then is really the appropriate time where it actually has a bit more traction to look at that. But it's a great comment with very good application for the coming years. Yeah.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. Just to bounce off, I think what you were trying to get at is that when you have high density, low income homes, the tendency is for folks to live more transient, in and out. Whereas when you invest in a house, you're more apt to stay there. And when you've got kids in these facilities that are coming in and out of the school system, it puts a lot of pressure on that particular school regarding performance. Is that what you're...
That was a large piece of part of my theory, too. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Schwartz, that exhausts the lights up here. That was a very nice presentation. This is it's great data, and it's going to really help us with community conversations as we move forward.
Well, you all get a copy of the presentation so you can look at it. Thank you for enduring the lengthy presentation.
It's good. That's what we need to do. That's why we're doing it. So enjoy your night.
Okay, all right. As well. Thank you.
Okay, so now I will reopen public comment. Anybody want to talk about what we just learned? Sure. Ms. Duffy.
I did find the statistics on the crime and the perception by the public very interesting. That's what I'm hearing from the people. They're very concerned about crime. Don't forget about that. I know it kind of got glossed over that this is just their perception, but it's a real perception out there. There's a lot going on, and people are really concerned.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And we certainly won't gloss that over. I think the different trends that you elaborated on help to say maybe how those numbers are qualified whether it's due to an increase in actual crime. And so that's something that we need to look at. Are we seeing those numbers rise? Or I looked at your neighborhood on Raids Online, and I would encourage you to take a look and see. And luckily you're in a pretty safe neighborhood compared to some of our other areas that have a lot more red, blue, and green dots on it. So it's Shakti.
I had a thought about the crime section that I didn't bring up earlier, that I think the question was, what do you think the most important role of government is? And I think that addressing crime is the most important role of government. It's sort of like the first step, and after you do that, you can work on other steps. So some of it might have had to do with the phrasing, not to minimize any of the crime that's out there.
Absolutely not. Okay, that's it. So now we have some reports. We spent a lot of time together with each other on Saturday, had a great planning session and retreat, and look forward to having some good conversations moving forward about where we're going to go this year. And a lot of it has to do with what we talked about tonight, with growth and infrastructure and congestion and density, things like that. So we are going to have some more opportunity as a group to figure out what exactly that looks like, and then we'll be rolling out to the community and really trying to engage the community and how we move forward. Also got to see how much we actually got done last year. So it was a nice opportunity for Ms. Hodson to read off what we've done and what's still in the works. So we have a great work plan with still some things to accomplish from last year, and we'll get that done and then move forward. A quick reminder to the relay running team that it's March 20th, which means it's about 2 months away from our relay that we have to run. And so 2 months away though. Yeah. May 20th, right? 21st. So anyways, to our team, who is on our team, I still am not clear. 1, 2, 3. Kathy's 4. And I think Karen Harrison's 5. So Kathy, you're going to have to do the longest. It's been 10K. But anyway, so that's good. So if anybody in the community wants to come and help us train or has any good tidbits for what to do, I think Mr. Abel has a hint.
Instead of timing yourself with a stopwatch, you might use an hourglass.
I said earlier I was just going to have Charlie park somewhere along the route, and I was going to jump in his truck. But that'll be good fun. So that's coming up, and that's all I have for tonight. So I'll just go all the way to my right and go left. Mr. Coop, nothing. Mr. Wickman? No report. Nothing. Mr. Gutwein?
Okay. So we talked about at a retreat that we should start giving reports on the committees that we're on. So I'm on the Dr. Cog committee, and I'm the alternate for the Dr. Cog committee, and we had a meeting on Wednesday. So I just wanted to briefly highlight some information, and I'd be happy to share with everyone the minutes. So there was a public hearing on the 2040 Metro Vision, which is kind of like the comprehensive plan for that Dr. Cog puts together in partnership with all of the cities that are active. And then we also spend a lot of the meetings during the legislative session going over bills and voting on whether or not we support the bills, similar to what we do here in Lakewood. And so there's a number of bills that are impacting transportation, including an electric bike bill, the transportation funding bill, and a number of others. And so that is essentially what we do, and I would be happy to share the actual minutes with everybody. And I did my first training run, and I am in big trouble. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And that's actually a nice idea that came up at the retreat. Everybody up here is on different committees and does different things, so to be able to share, that's great. Ms. Franks?
I just wanted to offer that if any of you plan to run in Ward 4 in the hilly area, feel free to stop by. I will offer a nice cool beverage for you while you all train.
So kind. Lemonade, thank you. Mr. Roybal?
No report.
Ms. Vincent?
No report.
Mr. Abel?
No report.
Ms. Johnson?
No report.
Ms. Shakti?
We have a ward meeting on Saturday, And I can give a little bit about my committees if people want. I don't want to feel like I'm torturing people. You could cut me off if you need to. So I'm on the Regional Air Quality Council, and we're out of compliance for ozone, so every so many years we have to pass a state implementation plan. It takes years to finalize one, and we finalized one, and it's going through the legislature. And so what RAC is working on now is research related to creating the next SIP. We also have done some rebranding on the Ozone Aware program. And then just a little note, ozone particularly is interesting to us in Lakewood because the rates are highest here near the foothills. Dr. Cog, just a little background, Dana talked about MetroVision. I think we worked on MetroVision for like 2 years. It was a really difficult, long process, and it passed unanimously. So that was exciting. Currently, the big issue that we're working on, gradually, things happen slowly at Dr. Cog's, is the urban growth boundary. Also, we're looking for a new executive director. We are on the personnel committee, and I missed the personnel committee meeting, and so we are now on the search committee because apparently that's how you get appointed. So we're working on that. I'm also at Dr. Cog, it's also the Area Agency on Aging, and there's an Area Committee on Aging, which is made up of the County Committee on Agency representatives from all of the regional counties. And in particular, they expressed an interest in improving, so Dr. Cog, like they said at the retreat, they do lobbying as part of their purview on senior issues, and the committee was interested in improving their lobbying skills. So I've been working with them on that, and tomorrow there's a special meeting held of all of the different committees, and they're going to cover different things, but one of them is working with them on how to organize so they can respond quickly when aging issues come up, and that they want to get their message known. I'm on, I've been attending West Connect, which is a consensus-based body of many governments that go along this corridor. So it goes up to Boulder and down to, I'm not sure what's the...
Littleton, South Jeffco.
Yeah, Littleton, South Jeffco. And mostly, so I wasn't able to make the last meeting, and I sent around the minutes from that meeting, but it's a study, and I've been trying to make it as broad as we can in looking at the different options in the study process, but we haven't seen options yet unless we did in that meeting. It's been sort of the preliminary stages.
And that has to do with C470, correct?
It has to do with C470 and 93 and basic a number of specific intersections and just sort of moving people through different areas and what are the different solutions. And then I attended the National League of Cities in part because I'm on the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee. Basically, NLC's lobbying at the federal level, their priorities are things that they feel like they might make progress on this year, so including infrastructure. But we're seeing a lot of cuts. The community development block grants, they're coming out pretty strong on that. And a lot of cuts related to environmental stuff. So we learned about some of that, and there'll be more activity. The main day of CML activity was canceled for a snowstorm, so that was a loss. There was some great information on sanctuary cities. What does it really mean? What are the ramifications? What are the other options? And I sent some of that information around. I'm also on the legislative committee, which is just a list of bills that we vote on, so I don't think a report really makes sense. And the screening committee, and you'll see the people soon.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And if anybody's ever looking for something to do on a Wednesday night, go to Dr. Cog and see 40-some different governments trying to get along and make some sort of policy. It's blissful. Michelle, nothing? Mr. Graham? Ms. Hodson?
Yes, I do have just one quick thing. Soon after the retreat, we heard from a few counselors who reported an increase in motor vehicle thefts as well as trespass on motor vehicles. So we're responding very quickly in two ways. You will see a link to the police department website on the Friday report. Where are we? Monday, this Friday, you'll see that. Just with some tips on how to protect yourself. So please make sure your constituents are aware of that. In addition, with the Looking at Lakewood, we'll do an article about crime prevention strategies related to these kind of crimes. So those are just some 2 quick takeaways. And I'll be meeting with the chief soon, in fact, tomorrow, to talk about additional strategies, so stay tuned for that. And it's also important to remember some real simple things. Please lock your vehicles. Sometimes it's that simple. Lock your vehicles. Also, make sure that you don't have valuables that are easy to see, that are real visible in your vehicle. So there isn't anything enticing. The police have told me that those are 2 really good things to exercise that'll help prevent these kind of crimes. So again, a link that you'll see on the Friday report to the police department webpage with some good information, as well as an article in Looking at Lakewood. And then we talked about some other kind of outreach, and you'll hear more about that. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that response. Anything else for the good of the order? Seeing none, thank you to our police agents for hanging out with us, and we will adjourn at